On one of my first weeks in vocational ministry, the pastor I was serving under took me to visit someone in our congregation in the hospital for the first time. The man we were visiting had recently become a widow. His wife had just passed away, but now he was facing some of his own health struggles and was hospitalized. So when we got to his room, we asked him how he was doing. And I've always remembered how he responded, because when we asked him how he was doing in his hospital room, he said, "I miss my wife. We were married for 50 years." The reason that always stuck with me is because we were really asking how he was doing medically and physically, but the way that he responded communicated in a profound way that whatever health discomfort he was going through, it couldn't compare to the pain of his relational loss. I don't know what it's like to lose a spouse after 5 decades of marriage. Some of you do. But I do know, and I think we all do, that the deeper and more intimate and more significant of a relationship means a greater pain when it's gone. And what we're going to see this morning is we're going to see the awful story of how Jesus experienced the loss of the most significant, most intimate, and most powerful relationship in all reality. I know that what I'm asking us to do this morning is hard for some of us, because I'm asking us to meditate on some really sad things. And we live in a culture that, at least to me, often seems like it's addicted to happiness. And I experience that in my own life. A lot of us feel like we have enough sadness in our lives already, but sometimes the path to joy is through the right kind of sadness. And so I want to ask you, even though it'll be hard at points, to reflect on what it means that Jesus was forsaken by God his Father. And I'll invite you to turn to Mark chapter 15 in your copy of the Bible. Our sermon passage this morning is all of Mark 15. That's verses 1 through 47. If you don't have a copy of the Bible with you, it was mentioned earlier in the service, but there is that black-covered pew Bible, which you're, of course, welcome to use. And if you want to follow along with the sermon in that copy of the Bible, you can find Mark 15 starting on page 852. I also want to make sure you understand that part of the reason that this service might feel like Good Friday in November is because we're coming to the conclusion of an almost year-long study through the Gospel of Mark. And today we've come to the climax of the entire story, which is the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. And it's important to remember that as we join Jesus this morning, that he has already been betrayed by one of his closest friends, Judas. His other disciples have deserted him, and the Jewish religious leaders have condemned and viciously abused him. So as we join Jesus this morning, he has already been forsaken by both his friends and his enemies. But this story is about a much, much worse forsakenness. And I invite you to stand as I read this passage out loud. Mark 15, beginning in verse 1, reading to the end of the chapter. And as soon as it was morning, the chief priests held a consultation with the elders and scribes and the whole council, and they bound Jesus and led him away and delivered him over to Pilate. And Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And he answered him, "You have said so." And the chief priests accused him of many things. And Pilate again asked him, "Have you no answer to make? See how many charges they bring against you." But Jesus made no further answer, so that Pilate was amazed. Now at the feast he used to release for them one prisoner for whom they asked. And among the rebels in prison who had committed murder in the insurrection, there was a man named Barabbas. And the crowd came up and began to ask Pilate to do as he usually did for them. And he answered them, saying, "Do you want me to release for you the king of the Jews?" For he perceived that it was out of envy that the chief priests had delivered him up. But the chief priests stirred up the crowd to have him release for them Barabbas instead. And Pilate again said to them, "Then what shall I do with the man you call the king of the Jews?" And they cried out again, "Crucify him." And Pilate said to them, "Why? What evil has he done?" But they shouted all the more, "Crucify him." So Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, released for them Barabbas, and having scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified. And the soldiers led him away inside the palace, that is, the governor's headquarters, and they called together the whole battalion. And they clothed him in a purple cloak, and twisting together a crown of thorns, they put it on him, and they began to salute him, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they were striking his head with a reed and spitting on him and kneeling down in homage to him. And when they had mocked him, they stripped him of the purple cloak and put his own clothes on him, and they led him out to crucify him. And they compelled a passerby, Simon of Cyrene, who was coming in from the country, the father of Alexander and Rufus, to carry his cross. And they brought him to the place called Golgotha, which means place of the skull. And they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. And they crucified him and divided his garments among them, casting lots for them to decide what each should take. And it was the third hour when they crucified him. And the inscription of the charge against him read, "The King of the Jews." And with him they crucified two robbers, one on his right and one on his left. And those who passed by derided him, wagging their heads and saying, "Aha, you who would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself and come down from the cross." So also the chief priests with the scribes mocked him to one another, saying, "He saved others. He cannot save himself. Let the Christ, the King of Israel, come down now from the cross, that we may see and believe." Those who were crucified with him also reviled him. And when the 6th hour had come, there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour. And at the 9th hour, Jesus cried with a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And some of the bystanders hearing it said, "Behold, he is calling Elijah." And someone ran and filled a sponge with sour wine, put it on a reed, and gave it to him to drink, saying, "Wait, let us see whether Elijah will come to take him down." And Jesus uttered a loud cry and breathed his last. And the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And when the centurion who stood facing him saw that in this way he breathed his last, he said, "Truly this man was the Son of God." There were also women looking on from a distance, among whom were Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of James the younger and of Joseph and Salome. When he was in Galilee, they followed him and ministered to him. And there were also many other women who came up with him to Jerusalem. And when evening had come, since it was the day of preparation, that is, the day before the Sabbath, Joseph of Arimathea, a respected member of the council, who was also himself looking for the kingdom of God, took courage and went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Pilate was surprised to hear that he should have already died. And summoning the centurion, he asked him whether he was already dead. And when he learned from the centurion that he was dead, he granted the corpse to Joseph. And Joseph brought a linen shroud, and taking him down, wrapped him in the linen shroud, and laid him in a tomb that had been cut out of the rock. And he rolled a stone against the entrance of the tomb. Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, saw where he was laid. You may be seated. My God, why have you forsaken me? Verses 1 through 15 show how Jesus was forsaken by God to condemnation. The Jewish religious leaders wanted Jesus crucified, but they didn't have the legal authority to do it themselves, which is why Pilate enters the story. They had to bring Jesus to Pilate in hopes that he, because he was the Roman governor, would sentence Jesus to death and carry out the crucifixion. So Pilate interrogated Jesus by asking if he was, you see in verse 2, the King of the Jews. Jesus responded, "You have said so." Those would be the final words that Jesus would say for hours, all the way to verse 34. You would expect someone in his decision to try to talk themselves out of it in some way, to try to defend themselves. So it was amazing to Pilate that Jesus was just silent as accusation after accusation was thrown at him. Isaiah 53, verse 7, he was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that before its shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth. It was so significant that Jesus fulfilled this prophecy because it showed that he wasn't going kicking and screaming to the death that God his Father had planned for him, but he was willingly accepting what God wanted. Pilate, though, knew that Jesus was innocent. This shouldn't have happened on so many levels. He perceived, according to verse 10, that it was out of envy that the chief priests had delivered him up. But as you heard in the story, he made a political calculation. It was apparently an annual tradition that Pilate would release this time of year a Jewish prisoner as a demonstration of goodwill. And so Pilate offered either Jesus or this notorious criminal named Barabbas. Now, this was a gamble by Pilate, but he was apparently trying to work some way out of this dilemma where he could do what he knew was the right thing, but not offend the Jewish religious leaders in the process, because they were important power brokers in the people that he was overseeing. But the Jewish religious leaders outmaneuvered Pilate. They convinced people in the crowd to ask for Barabbas instead. And Pilate folded. He wasn't prepared to go against public opinion. So verse 15 says that to satisfy the crowd, he released Barabbas, but had Jesus scourged. A scourging was a brutal, barbaric punishment where people were whipped with leather lashes. And a lot of times they would have metal, bone woven into the lashes, and it would rip the skin off of people being scourged and reveal muscle, bone underneath. That's what it means that Jesus was forsaken by God to condemnation. Verses 16 through 20 show that also Jesus was forsaken by God to shame. Roman soldiers were the ones actually tasked with carrying out the death sentence against Jesus. And I would expect, or at least hope, that in our criminal justice system, that if somebody was given capital punishment, that sentence would be carried out with some degree of dignity, some degree of sadness, some degree of respect. But Jesus was viciously mocked by his execution squad. Since he had claimed to be the king of the Jews, they put a purple cloak on him because that was the color of royalty. Then they twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head. And then they sarcastically saluted him and bowed to him and beat him on the head and spat on him. Jesus is the eternal Son of God, worshipped by angels. But instead, he received this insulting torture from people that he created. That's what it means that Jesus was forsaken by God to shame. But verses 21 through 32 show that Jesus was also forsaken by God to suffering. There was the physical suffering. Verse 24 says, they crucified him. A lot is packed into those three words because Jesus would have been stripped of his clothes, nailed to the cross through his hands and feet, and he would hang there for hours until he could no longer support the weight of his own body to breathe, and died by suffocation. It was a brutally slow death. But as bad as the physical suffering was, there was also the emotional suffering. I recently heard the story, and isn't this awful, of a man who was released from prison after 27 years because he had been wrongly convicted of murder. Imagine the emotional suffering that he must have gone through. If you can even start to guess at that, process that what Jesus went through was so much worse. Because Jesus was not only innocent of the specific crime that he was accused of, he was innocent of any crime. He had never done anything wrong that could justify in any reality anyone doing anything to him that would cause him suffering. But he was mocked by the bystanders. He was even mocked by the criminals he was crucified with. And there would be no chance to undo what was happening to him, humanly speaking, because he was receiving the irreversible punishment of death. Jesus was forsaken by God to suffering. But verses 33 through 41 show that Jesus was also forsaken by God to death. Jesus had been on the cross already for about 3 hours when verse 33 says that darkness covered where he was from the 6th hour until the 9th hour. If we convert that to our time, that would be from 12 p.m., noon, to 3 p.m. So that means that this darkness happened during the hottest and brightest part of the day. And it symbolized divine grief, tragedy, wrath. And remember, Jesus had been silent for hours. He hasn't said a word since verse 2, but he spoke the final recorded words we have from him in Mark in verse 34. Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani. Jesus spoke in Aramaic, but Mark wrote in Greek. So, what that means is that usually Mark would go ahead and translate the original Aramaic words of Jesus into Greek for his first readers. But in verse 34, Mark communicates the exact Aramaic words that Jesus spoke, which is why he translates them for us. My God, why have you forsaken me? So your English Bible, to help you understand that, brings through the exact Aramaic words transliterated into English, and then gives you the translation that Mark would have done in Greek for his original readers in English. The significance of this can be felt if you ask yourself, have you ever heard someone say something that you would never forget? The reason Mark probably gives us the exact Aramaic words of Jesus, because what he said exactly was branded on the minds of the people who heard it, because it was so horrifying. I've already described the physical and emotional suffering Jesus experienced, and periodically people will try to capture this in maybe movies or TV shows to try to show in some way what Jesus went through. But look, one thing that can never be captured is the worst suffering Jesus experienced, which was spiritual. He had been forsaken by his disciples, by the Jewish religious leaders, by politicians, by the crowds, by soldiers, even by the criminals he was crucified with. But the most profound suffering he faced was being forsaken by God, his Father. And like verse 37 says, Jesus breathed his last. So there was no last-minute rescue. Jesus was forsaken by God to death. But verses 42 through 47 show that Jesus was also forsaken by God to the grave. One of the few bright spots in this very hard story is Joseph of Arimathea. He was apparently a respected member of the same Jewish council that had condemned Jesus. Based on what he did, it looks like he would have dissented from that decision because verse 43 says, he was also himself looking for the kingdom of God. So he took courage because showing support for Jesus publicly could lead to all types of consequences for him. And he asked Pilate if he could bury Jesus. And Pilate unexpectedly agreed. Maybe Pilate did this because he knew that he had politically scapegoated Jesus. This is significant because people who were crucified were usually not given dignified burials. They might be thrown in mass graves with other criminals. They might be shallowly covered with dirt in a public graveyard. But Joseph, probably as an act of devotion, as an expression of the wrong that he knew had been done, went through the expensive process of wrapping Jesus in clothes and burying him in his own tomb. That would have been a costly thing, just like it is for people today. You know, we do whatever we can do to make burial a beautiful thing for our loved ones. And that's what we should do. But we all know that the grave is a brutal destination. When someone is buried, it powerfully communicates the finality of death. It communicates darkness. It communicates decay. And that's where Jesus went. We don't know exactly where Jesus' soul was in the time that he was buried, but we know where his body was. And because he was buried, we know that he experienced all that death is. He was forsaken by God to the grave. One Christian has described trying to understand the suffering of Jesus like standing on the edge of a bottomless canyon and taking a rock and tossing it into the canyon. You would be able to see the rock fall for a while until it eventually disappeared into the darkness, and you would never hear it hit the bottom. We can say that Jesus was forsaken to condemnation, to shame, to suffering, to death, to the grave. That's how far we can see the rock fall. But then it vanishes, never to hit the bottom, because we know that his suffering was bottomless, beyond our ability to comprehend. This story we're meditating on is horrible, but it does contain hints of resurrection. These are almost like stars in the darkest night sky. One of those hints of resurrection is the way that Jesus died. Look at verse 37. Jesus uttered a loud cry and breathed his last. Remember, I said that people who were crucified suffocated to death. So almost by definition, people dying on the cross were in no position to yell. But in an incredible display of strength, not physical strength, but spiritual power, Jesus went out with a mighty yell. That's why verse 44 says, Pilate was surprised to hear that he should have already died and actually investigated to see if that was true. That's because Jesus went out on his own terms. Jesus wasn't strangled out, but offered his life. He didn't go out begging for mercy, losing his mind, but in control. There's another hint of resurrection in this story, and that's the irony of it. You know what I'm talking about by irony? If someone didn't recognize Elon Musk and went up to him and said, "Who do you think you are? The richest man alive?" That would be ironic. Now, the irony in this story is not even slightly humorous, but this story is saturated with that type of irony. Jesus is repeatedly called the King of the Jews, 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 5 times. And he's called the Christ, the King of Israel. The irony is that the people who said that about Jesus didn't actually think it was true. But we know the ironic truth. We see him robed in bloody purple, wearing a crown of thorns and enthroned on the cross. He is the King of the Jews. He is the Christ, the King of Israel. It was just as ironic when Jesus was mocked, verse 30. Save yourself. Come down from the cross. Verse 31. He saved others. He cannot save himself. We know the ironic truth. Jesus could have saved himself, but he didn't because he was saving others. Maybe the most powerful hint of resurrection in this story is how it fulfills Psalm 22. Josh read that passage for us earlier in the service. And if you heard when he read it, or maybe you'll want to go back and read it later, Psalm 22 reads like a poetic play-by-play of the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, written hundreds of years before it happened. I'll give you some examples. Psalm 22, verse 18 says, "They divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots." That's fulfilled in verse 24 of Mark 15. Another example, Psalm 22:7 says, "All who see me mock me. They make mouths at me. They wag their heads." That's fulfilled in chapter 15, verse 29 of Mark. And on and on. But most importantly, Psalm 22:1, my God, why have you forsaken me?" So when Jesus screamed those words in verse 34, he wasn't pulling them out of thin air. He was quoting the opening words of Psalm 22. And why that's so important is because this song ends not in forsakenness, but in victory. The song goes on to say, verse 21, "You have rescued me." It goes on to say, verse 24, "He has not despised or abhorred the affliction of the afflicted, and he has not hidden his face from him, but has heard when he cried to him." And the final words of that song are, "He has done it." So in his darkest moment of forsakenness, the worst moment in his life, Jesus quoted Psalm 22, verse 1, not only because it expressed the forsakenness he felt, but because it communicated his hope that God would vindicate him. So those hints of resurrection tell us that the story isn't over. You know, if this was going to be the ending, verse 46 should have been the last words. "And he rolled a stone against the entrance of the tomb." But look at verse 47. "Mary and Mary saw where he was laid." And those words foreshadow how those two women would become some of the first witnesses to his resurrection. So if this Sunday is like Good Friday in November, I am really excited for next Sunday because we get to celebrate Easter Sunday in November. But still, why? Even though we can see hints of resurrection in this story, why didn't God step in? Why didn't God stop the worst crime in human history from happening and save his son? In the temple in Jerusalem, there was a curtain. It was 60 feet high, 30 feet wide, and it separated the direct presence of God from the rest of the temple. One of my favorite children's books, and I know that a lot of you have it in your homes, is The Garden, the Curtain, and the Cross. And in that book, that curtain that I'm talking about is called a big keep out sign. That's because it was a physical reminder that God was separated from his people because of their sin. But look at verse 38. Because it says that when Jesus died, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. It was like two divine hands had reached down from heaven, grabbed the big keep out sign, and ripped it apart. Because God had opened the way for his people to have a relationship with him. 2 Corinthians 5:21 puts it this way: for our sake, he made him to be sin who knew no sin, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. Jesus never sinned. Even on the cross, he remained totally morally pure. But in a way that we can't understand, on the cross, Jesus became greed. He became lust. He became anger and murder and theft and lies and genocide and rape and fraud and every other expression of human evil. And then he took all the shame, all the wrath that it deserved. So why was Jesus forsaken by God to condemnation, shame, suffering, death, and the grave? Because that's what we deserved. God the Father forsook his Son because he was setting you free. Jesus was forsaken so you could be accepted. But most of the people who saw the cross happening, the people who were actually there, totally misunderstood it. If you look at verses 35 through 36, the people who were there to actually hear what Jesus said when it first happened thought he was asking for Elijah to come and save him. They thought he needed alcohol to numb his pain. If the people who were actually historically present could completely miss the point of the cross, then we definitely can. We can read the story of the cross, hear it explained, and just treat it like a moving story of sacrifice, like it's about a martyr dying for the right thing, like it's just a sentimental story that sets an example for us. But look at the Roman soldier in verse 39, who must have been the least likely person to recognize the true identity of Jesus. This was a member of his execution squad. But he said in verse 39, truly, this man was the Son of God. Look, the test of whether or not you get the true meaning of the cross isn't ultimately how you feel about it in this moment. It's not whether it makes you cry, although that might be a perfectly appropriate response to this story. The test of whether or not you get the true meaning of the cross is not your emotions which rise and fall, but it's whether or not, standing at the foot of the cross, you confess, truly, this man was the Son of God. And you repent of your sin that put him there. You believe in what he did in your place for your salvation. And then you take up your own cross to follow him. That's the only test of whether or not you actually understand what it means that Jesus was forsaken so that you can be accepted.